The morning I found that pearl white Range Rover blocking my dad's medical transport for the third time in a single week, I didn't oppose, scream, or pound on a steering wheel. Instead, I just stood there in the quiet 6 a.m. fog and felt this strange, cold clarity wash over me. You see, my dad is a retired firefighter who spent 30 years pulling people out of burning buildings until a structural collapse took his legs, and seeing him sitting there in his wheelchair behind the glass of the van, looking small and defeated because he was about to miss his physical therapy, it did something to me. And right across the street, peering through her designer kitchen curtains with a lukewarm kale smoothie in her hand, was Evelyn Evie Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Crest Homeowners Association. She wasn't an oppose, just watching. She was savoring the moment, wearing this tiny, sharp smirk that suggested she'd won some kind of invisible war. But what she didn't in oppose, realized was that her $90,000 status symbol was about to vanish from her life forever, and she was going to be the one to hand me the keys to her own destruction. My name's Leo Vance. I'm a landscape architect by trade, and I made the mistake of moving back into my childhood home in Oak Crest, a neighborhood that used to be full of kids playing tag, but had somehow transformed into a suburban police state while I was away. My grandmother, Ruth, was a woman who'd spit nails and call it breakfast, and she'd spent 40 years keeping the HOA at bay with a file folder full of original deeds and a temperament that made local politicians tremble. When she passed, she left me the house, and with my wife, Sarah, 7 months pregnant, and my dad needing a place without stairs, it felt like a blessing until I met Evie Sterling. Evie is the kind of person who smells like expensive laundry detergent and condescension. The type who uses the word community as a weapon to make sure everyone in Oppo's grass is exactly 2.5 inches tall, and she decided from day one that the Van Cest didn't in Oppo's fit the aesthetic of her perfect little kingdom. The real trouble started when I built the ramp for Dad. Nothing fancy, just a clean, ADA-compliant cedar ramp, so he could actually get into his own front door without a team of professional weightlifters. 3 hours after the last screw went in, I had a neon orange violation notice taped to my neck, citing unauthorized structural modification affecting street view harmony, I tried to talk to her, I really did. I walked over to her driveway where she was buffing a smudge off her Range Rover, which, by the way, had a vanity plate that literally read Jardine Guru, and I told her, Evie, my dad's a hero who can't walk. He needs this to live, and she just looked at me over her sunglasses, sighed like I was a toddler explaining a crayon drawing, and said, Leo, we all have burdens, but we don in oppos. Let them ruin the curb appeal of the block. The committee will review your in oppos, hardship in oppos, in 90 days, provided you pay the $250 daily noncompliance fee. That night, I watched my dad try to haul himself up the back steps because he was too proud to use the illegal ramp, and his arms gave out, and seeing him slumped there on the concrete, gasping for breath while the motion sensor light on Evie's house flickered on like a spotlight on his shame. That was the moment Leo Vance died, and something much more calculated took his place. But here's the thing about people like Evie. They aren't in oppos, just bullies. They're usually hiding a massive, crumbling foundation under all that fresh paint, and I started noticing things. I noticed that while she was flagging me for having the wrong shade of mulch, there were 3 Sterling interiors vans parked in her circular driveway every afternoon, which is a direct violation of the HOA's strict no commercial vehicle policy. Then Sarah, who's a researcher and has a brain like a steel trap, started digging into the public tax records because something about Evie's consulting business didn't in oppos add up with the way she was spending money. We found out that Evie was and oppos just the HOA president. She had somehow maneuvered herself into being the sole signatory for the neighborhood's maintenance and beautification fund, a pot of money that hadn't and oppos been audited since the Obama administration. The harassment didn't in oppos stop at the ramp, though. It got personal and it got ugly. One afternoon, Sarah called me at work, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe because Ann, compliance officer, end quote, from the county had shown up at our door claiming there had been an anonymous tip about, end quote, unsafe and unsanitary conditions for an unborn child. End quote. They had to inspect our nursery, our kitchen, even our medicine cabinet, and while this poor officer was apologizing for the intrusion, I looked out the window and saw Evie standing on her lawn, pointing her iPhone at our house like she was filming a documentary on poverty. She was trying to get the state to take our baby before she was even born, all because I wooed and oppose. Take down a wooden ramp. I sat in my truck in the driveway that night, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and I realized that if I played by the rules, she'd destroy us. So I decided it was time to change the game entirely. I spent the next 2 weeks becoming a ghost. I stopped arguing, I stopped filing appeals, and I even started painting the ramp the exact, soul-crushing beige she demanded, which made her think I'd finally broken. In reality, I was spending my nights with a guy named, end quote, Big Sal, end quote, a retired surveyor who'd mapped this county 40 years ago and still kept the original hand-drawn plat maps in his basement. Sal and I spent 6 hours over a bottle of cheap scotch looking at the Oak Crest development plans from 1984, and that's when we found the, end quote, golden bullet, end quote, the kind of mistake that only happens when a developer is too greedy and a city planner is too tired. It turned out that when the Sterling house was built, they'd encroached nearly 8 feet onto the, end quote, common utility easement, end quote, meaning Evie's prized, heated, stamped concrete driveway was, and oppose, actually hers. It belonged to the HOA, and by extension, the city's fire access code. But I didn't oppose. Stop there, because if you oppose, we're going to take down a queen, you don't oppose. Just trip her, you dismantle the throne. I reached out to a cousin of mine who works in forensic accounting, and we started a, end quote, neighborly support group, end quote, on a private encrypted app, reaching out to all the people Evie had stepped on over the years, the elderly couple she'd sued over their birdbath, the single mom she'd fined for her kid's sidewalk chalk, the veteran she tried to evict because his service dog barked once. We became a silent army, sharing bank statements, fine notices, and weirdly enough, photos of Evie's Range Rover. It turned out that, end quote, Giardine Guru, end quote, was a bit of a habitual offender. She'd been using the HOA's tax-exempt status to buy fuel, tires, and even professional detailing for that car, labeling it as, end quote, emergency neighborhood patrol equipment, end quote. The trap was set for the Oak Crest Founders Day Gala, which was Evie's, end quote, coronation, end quote, the one night of the year where she got to wear a gown and hand out, end quote, civic pride, end quote, awards to the neighbors she hated the least. She had invited the local news, the mayor, and a bunch of high-end real estate developers because she was planning to announce her run for the city council. It was the perfect stage. That morning, she'd blocked my driveway again, her Range Rover sitting diagonally across my exit, as if to say, end quote, Don and oppose, to even think about coming to my party, end quote. I didn't oppose. Call her I didn't oppose. To even knock on her door, I just picked up the phone and called a towing company out of the next county, a company owned by a guy who'd lost his own house to a corrupt HOA 5 years ago and had been waiting for a call like this his entire life. When the tow truck pulled onto our quiet street, it didn't oppose. Have its lights on. It just slid in like a silent predator. I walked out with my dad in his wheelchair, Sarah by my side, and Big Sal holding the original 1984 maps. We met the driver at the back of Evie's car, and just as the hooks were being set, Evie came flying out of her front door, clutching a glass of champagne and screaming so loud the neighbors' dogs started howling. End quote. What the hell do you think you and oppose? Redoing. That's a $90,000 vehicle. I'm the president of this association. End quote. I just smiled, held up a laminated copy of the city's fire access code and the HOA's own bylaws, the one she'd written herself, and I said, end quote, actually, Evie, according to Article 4, Section 2, any vehicle obstructing a designated utility easement or blocking emergency access for a resident with documented medical needs is subject to immediate, non-consensual impoundment. And since this driveway is technically public HOA land that you've been illegally occupying, your car is currently in oppose, littering and oppose, on community property. End quote. Her face went from a pale ivory to a deep, bruised purple as she tried to grab the maps from Sal, But that's when the second act of the play began. Two black SUVs pulled up behind the tow truck, and out stepped three men in windbreakers that didn't end oppos. T say in quote, HOA in quote, they said in quote, IRS in quote, and in quote, state auditor, in quote. It turns out that when you submit 3 years of falsified expense reports and proof of embezzlement to the right authorities, they don into oppos. T wait for a formal invitation. The news crew she'd invited for her big announcement arrived just in time to see the in quote, garden guru in quote. Being read her Miranda writes while her Range Rover was hoisted into the air, its alarm wailing like a dying animal. The look on her face when she realized her own husband, who we found out she was also cheating on, was the one who'd handed over the private bank passwords in exchange for immunity. That was better than any in quote, civic pride in quote, award I could ever receive. As the tow truck pulled away, dragging her status symbol toward a dusty impound lot in the middle of nowhere, and the police guided her into the back of a cruiser, the neighborhood became eerily quiet. People started coming out onto their porches, not hiding behind curtains anymore, but actually standing there watching the fog lift. My dad looked up at me, squeezed my hand, and for the first time in months, I saw that spark back in his eyes, the look of a man who knew the fire was finally out. We didn't in oppos. T stay for the gala. We went inside, ordered 3 extra-large pizzas, and watched the local news lead with, in quote, suburban dictator falls, HOA fraud exposed, in quote. In the weeks that followed, the Oak Crest HOA was essentially dissolved and rebuilt from scratch. The, in quote, maintenance fund, in quote, was recovered, and every single person Evie had fined was issued a full refund with interest. The, in quote, sterling interiors, in quote, vans disappeared. The Range Rover was sold at a police auction to cover her legal fees, and the last I heard, Evie is living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the interstate, where the HOA is so strict she's been fined twice for the color of her doormat. It's funny how life works out, how the very rules you use to cage others usually end up being the ones that trap you, and how a simple wooden ramp for a tired old hero can end up being the lever that moves a mountain. But I have to ask, if you were in my shoes and you saw your family being pushed to the brink by someone who thought they were, in quote, above, in quote, the neighborhood, would you have waited for the law to catch up? Or would you have built the trap yourself? Because some people say I went too far, that I destroyed a woman's entire life over a driveway dispute. But when you threaten a man's home and his father's dignity, do you really get to complain about how the payback tastes? Drop a comment and tell me, was I the hero of this story or just a different kind of monster?